The desert sand whipped across Sarah Martinez's face as she crouched behind the concrete barrier, her rifle steady in her hands. The morning sun blazed overhead, turning the Afghan landscape into a furnace that seemed to cook everything in sight. She had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Phoenix for 8 months now, and every day felt like a test of survival. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and adjusted her helmet. At 24, she was one of the youngest soldiers in her unit, but her sharp shooting skills and quick thinking had earned her respect among the seasoned veterans. She came from a small town in Texas where her father had taught her to hunt rabbits in the scrubland behind their house. Those childhood lessons now served her well in this harsh environment. The radio crackled to life. Martinez, Johnson, Rodriguez, patrol duty in 15 minutes, came the gravelly voice of Sergeant Williams. Sarah sighed and checked her gear one more time. These routine patrols through the nearby village had become increasingly dangerous as insurgent activity picked up in recent weeks. She made her way to the assembly point where her teammates were already gathering. Private Johnson, a lanky kid from Ohio, was nervously checking his ammunition for the 3rd time. Corporal Rodriguez, a veteran with 2 tours under his belt, stood calmly smoking a cigarette. The 3 of them had become close friends during their deployment, watching each other's backs through countless missions. "Intel says the village has been quiet," Rodriguez said, crushing his cigarette under his boot. "But you know how reliable that is." Sarah nodded, knowing that quiet often meant trouble was brewing just beneath the surface. As they walked toward the village, the heat seemed to press down on them like a heavy blanket. The local children usually came running to greet the American soldiers, hoping for candy or small toys. Today the streets were eerily empty. Sarah felt her instincts kick in, her senses heightening as they moved deeper into the settlement. The mud brick houses stood silent in the blazing sun. Laundry hung motionless on lines strung between buildings. Even the usual sounds of daily life, mothers calling to children, the bleating of goats, the distant hum of conversation, were absent. Rodriguez raised his hand, signaling them to stop. "Something's not right," he whispered into his radio. "Village is completely deserted." Sarah scanned the rooftops and windows, looking for any sign of movement. Her training had taught her to trust her gut, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. The silence felt heavy and unnatural, like the calm before a violent storm. They continued their patrol, moving carefully from building to building. Sarah noticed that many doors were slightly ajar, as if people had left in a hurry. Cooking pots sat abandoned on cold stoves, and children's toys lay scattered in the dust. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. As they rounded a corner, Johnson suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. In the distance, they could make out the faint sound of engines approaching. Not the familiar rumble of American military vehicles, but something else entirely. Rodriguez immediately got on the radio. "Base, this is Patrol 7. We've got unknown vehicles approaching the village. Request immediate backup." The response came back filled with static, but the message was clear. They were on their own for now. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the sound grew louder. Through the heat haze, she could see dust clouds rising from the desert road. Whatever was coming their way, it wasn't friendly. The fact that the village had been evacuated suggested that local contacts had warned the residents to leave. "There," Rodriguez pointed to a partially collapsed building that would provide good cover. "We need to get to higher ground and assess the situation." They moved quickly but carefully, using the empty buildings for concealment. From their new position, Sarah could see the approaching convoy clearly. 3 pickup trucks filled with armed men were racing toward the village. She counted at least 12 fighters, all carrying automatic weapons. This wasn't a random patrol. It was a coordinated attack force. "They're heading straight for the center of town," Johnson observed, his voice tight with tension. Sarah realized they were likely walking into an ambush that had been set specifically for American patrols. Someone had leaked information about their routine routes. Rodriguez was already calling for air support, but Sarah knew it would take time for helicopters or jets to reach their position. In the meantime, they were outnumbered 4-1 and trapped in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The lead truck suddenly stopped about 200 meters from their position. Sarah watched through her scope as the fighters began to dismount and spread out in a coordinated pattern. These weren't amateur insurgents. They moved with military precision and discipline. "They know we're here," she whispered to her teammates. This whole thing was a setup. As if to confirm her words, one of the fighters raised a radio to his mouth and began speaking rapidly. Within seconds, the other groups began moving toward different sections of the village, clearly executing a planned search pattern. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of their options. They could try to fight their way out, but the odds were heavily against them. They could attempt to hide and wait for rescue, but the enemy seemed to know exactly where to look. Or they could try to break through the encirclement and reach the open desert, though that would leave them exposed and vulnerable. The radio crackled with an urgent message from base. "Patrol 7, we're tracking hostile movement in your area. Extraction helicopter is being prepared, but we need at least 30 minutes to reach your position. Find cover and hold your position." Sarah looked at Rodriguez and Johnson, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. 30 minutes felt like an eternity when facing superior numbers and firepower, but they had trained for situations exactly like this. They would need to use every skill they possessed to survive until help arrived. The sound of boots on gravel was getting closer. Sarah checked her rifle one more time and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, she was ready to fight for her life and protect her brothers in arms. The real test was just beginning. The first gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, sending birds scattering from their perches in the few scraggly trees that dotted the village. Sarah ducked instinctively as the bullet struck the wall just inches from her head, sending chunks of dried mud and concrete flying. Rodriguez immediately returned fire, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. "Contact, multiple hostiles. 2 o'clock, he shouted into his radio while sliding behind better cover. Johnson positioned himself at the opposite corner of their building, creating a crossfire pattern that would make it harder for the enemy to advance. Sarah steadied her breathing and acquired her first target through the scope. A fighter in a dark headscarf was moving between buildings about 150 meters away, trying to flank their position. She led him slightly, accounting for his movement, and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped immediately. "One down," she called, out already searching for her next target. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from those long-ago hunting trips. "One shot, one kill. Make every bullet count because you might not get a second chance." The insurgents were well-trained and disciplined. Instead of charging recklessly, they used the village's layout to their advantage, moving from house to house while maintaining suppressing fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes coming from at least 6 different positions now, and she knew more fighters were probably moving to surround them. "We need to relocate," Rodriguez called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "They're trying to pin us down here." He pointed toward a 2-story building about 50 meters to their left. "That roof will give us better visibility and more escape routes." Johnson nodded and prepared to provide covering fire. "On 3, he said, raising his weapon. Sarah gathered herself for the sprint, knowing they would be exposed for several crucial seconds during the move. 1, 2, 3. Johnson opened fire in rapid succession, forcing the enemy fighters to take cover. Sarah and Rodriguez broke from their positions simultaneously, running in zigzag patterns toward their new location. Bullets whined through the air around them, kicking up small explosions of dust and debris. Sarah reached the building first and immediately began climbing the exterior stairs to the roof, while Rodriguez covered the ground-level entrances. The view from above gave her a much clearer picture of their tactical situation, and what she saw wasn't encouraging. The enemy had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the village center, with at least 3 teams of fighters moving to close the gaps in their perimeter. More concerning was the sight of additional vehicles approaching from the main road, reinforcements that would tip the odds even further against them. "Base, this is Patrol 7, Rodriguez's voice came through on the radio. "We are heavily engaged with approximately 15 to 20 hostiles. Additional enemy forces approaching from the southeast. We need that extraction ASAP." The response was partially garbled by static, but Sarah caught the important parts. "Helicopter inbound, 15 minutes. Hold position. 15 minutes. Sarah settled into a prone firing position on the rooftop and began systematically engaging targets. Her childhood training with her father had emphasized patience and precision over speed, lessons that served her well now. While Johnson and Rodriguez maintained rapid suppressing fire, she took careful aim and eliminated threats one by one. A fighter appeared in a window across the street, preparing to launch what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade. Sarah put her crosshairs on him and fired before he could complete his aim. The man fell backward and the RPG clattered harmlessly to the ground. "Nice shot," Johnson called from below, but Sarah was already moving, knowing that muzzle flash from her rifle would have revealed her position to other fighters in the area. Sure enough, within seconds, the roof around her previous position erupted in a hail of automatic weapons fire. She rolled behind a low wall and keyed her radio. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the southeast. Looks like at least 20 more fighters." Through her scope, she could see the dust clouds growing larger as the reinforcements drew closer. Rodriguez cursed under his breath. "We can't hold this position against those numbers. We need to move toward the extraction point." The designated landing zone for helicopters was an open area on the northern edge of the village, about 300 meters from their current position. Getting there would require crossing several streets and open areas while under fire from multiple directions. "I'll provide overwatch," Sarah volunteered. "You two move first and I'll keep the shooters busy from up here." Before Rodriguez could object, the sound of rotor blades became audible in the distance. Their extraction helicopter was approaching ahead of schedule, but so were the enemy reinforcements. It was going to be a race against time. Sarah began laying down precise covering fire as her teammates moved from building to building below. Each shot was calculated to force enemy fighters to take cover, rather than simply to kill, allowing Rodriguez and Johnson to advance while conserving her limited ammunition. The helicopter appeared as a black dot on the horizon, growing larger by the second. At the same time, the first of the enemy reinforcement vehicles entered the village, disgorging fresh fighters who immediately joined the battle. Sarah's radio crackled. "This is Dustoff 7-2, approaching LZ in 3 minutes. Heavy resistance observed. You need to get to that landing zone now." She fired her last few rounds at targets trying to position themselves between her teammates and the extraction point, then abandoned her sniper position and began moving rapidly across the rooftops. The insurgents had figured out her location and were concentrating fire on the building she had just vacated. Leaping from rooftop to rooftop, Sarah made her way toward the landing zone while enemy bullets snapped through the air around her. Below, she could see Rodriguez and Johnson approaching the designated area, but they were still 2 blocks away when the helicopter began its final approach. The aircraft came in fast and low, its door gunners already engaging targets around the landing zone. Sarah could see the pilot fighting to maintain control as ground fire peppered the aircraft's armored hull. She reached the edge of the last building and prepared to descend to ground level when she saw something that made her blood run cold. A fighter with an RPG had positioned himself in a perfect location to target the helicopter during its landing approach. Rodriguez and Johnson were too far away to see the threat, and the aircraft crew was focused on other targets. Without hesitation, Sarah raised her rifle and realized she had no ammunition left. The rocket-propelled grenade was already being raised to the fighter's shoulder, aimed directly at the vulnerable helicopter that represented their only chance of survival. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah watched the insurgent steady his aim on the approaching helicopter. Her rifle was empty, her sidearm was back with her gear on the lower floor, and the distance was too far for her to reach him before he could fire. But she couldn't just watch their salvation get blown out of the sky. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a piece of broken concrete from the roof and hurled it with all her strength at a metal sheet hanging loose from the adjacent building. The crash was loud enough to startle the RPG gunner, causing him to turn in her direction just as Rodriguez appeared around a corner below. Rodriguez saw the threat immediately and fired 3 quick shots. The insurgent fell, but not before accidentally triggering the RPG. The rocket streaked across the sky, missing the helicopter's tail rotor by mere feet before exploding harmlessly in the desert beyond the village. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its rotors never stopping as the crew chief waved frantically for the soldiers to board. Sarah leaped from the rooftop onto a lower building, then dropped to the ground and sprinted toward the aircraft. Enemy fire converged on the landing zone from multiple directions. The helicopter's door gunners returned fire with devastating effect, their heavy machine guns sweeping across insurgent positions and forcing the fighters to take cover. Rodriguez and Johnson reached the aircraft first, diving through the open doors as bullets sparked off the helicopter's armored hull. Sarah was still 50 meters away when she saw the pilot beginning to lift off slightly, preparing for a quick departure. "Wait!" Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise as he pointed toward Sarah's position. The pilot settled back down, but Sarah could see the strain on his face as he fought to keep the aircraft stable under heavy fire. She pumped her legs harder, zigzagging to avoid the increasingly accurate enemy fire. A bullet tugged at her sleeve. Another kicked up dust just inches from her boots. The helicopter seemed to grow larger with each step, but it also felt impossibly far away. 20 meters from safety, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder as a bullet grazed her, spinning her halfway around. She stumbled but kept running, her right hand pressed against the wound to slow the bleeding. Rodriguez and the crew chief reached out to pull her aboard as she made a final leap toward the helicopter's open door. Their hands closed around her gear and uniform, hauling her into the aircraft just as the pilot pulled collective and lifted them away from the deadly landing zone. The village fell away beneath them as they climbed rapidly into the desert sky. Sarah collapsed against the helicopter's interior wall, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. They had survived an overwhelming enemy force and made it to extraction, but barely. The crew chief, a sergeant with kind eyes and steady hands, immediately began treating Sarah's shoulder wound. "Just a graze," he shouted over the rotor noise. "You'll be fine." But Sarah could see concern in his expression that suggested her injury might be more serious than he was letting on. As they flew toward the main base, Sarah looked out the window at the landscape passing below. The adrenaline was wearing off, now replaced by exhaustion and the beginning of shock. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and she felt dizzy despite being seated. Rodriguez moved closer to check on her condition. "You saved our lives back there," he said, having to yell to be heard over the engine noise. "That RPG would have taken down the bird." Sarah nodded weakly, unable to form words as waves of pain washed over her. The crew chief was working quickly, applying bandages and checking her pulse. She noticed him exchanging glances with the pilot, but couldn't make out their conversation over the helicopter's roar. The flight back to base seemed to take forever. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of radio chatter and the crew chief monitoring her vital signs. At some point, she realized they weren't heading toward forward operating Base Phoenix where her unit was stationed. Instead, the helicopter was approaching a much larger facility, the main military hospital complex at Bagram Airfield. Through the haze of pain medication the crew chief had administered, Sarah wondered why they were taking her there instead of to the small medical facility at her home base. The helicopter landed on a marked helipad where a team of medical personnel was already waiting with a stretcher. Sarah tried to protest that she could walk, but her legs wouldn't support her weight when she attempted to stand. The medical team took over from the crew chief, quickly transferring her to the stretcher and rushing her toward the hospital entrance. Rodriguez and Johnson followed alongside, but were stopped at the door by a military policeman who explained that only medical personnel were allowed in the immediate treatment area. Sarah watched them through increasingly blurred vision as she was wheeled through sterile corridors lined with equipment and personnel. The emergency room was a controlled chaos of activity. Doctors and nurses moved efficiently between multiple patients, their voices calm and professional despite the obvious urgency of their work. Sarah was transferred to an examination table where a young doctor began a thorough assessment of her condition. "Gunshot wound to the left shoulder," the doctor dictated to a nurse. "Entry and exit wounds present, possible nerve damage, blood pressure dropping, start an IV and prep for surgery." Surgery? Sarah tried to ask what was wrong, why a simple graze required an operation, but the words wouldn't come. The room was getting darker around the edges, and she felt herself floating away from the noise and activity. When she regained consciousness, Sarah was lying in a hospital bed with her left arm immobilized in a complex sling. The pain in her shoulder had been replaced by a dull ache, and she felt groggy from whatever medications they had given her. A nurse noticed she was awake and came over to check her vital signs. "How are you feeling, Specialist Martinez?" the woman asked with a gentle smile. "Like I got hit by a truck," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse and weak. "How long was I out?" "About 6 hours. The surgery went well, but the bullet did more damage than it initially appeared. You're going to need several weeks of recovery time before you'll be cleared for duty." Several weeks. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what this meant for her. Deployment. While her teammates continued their mission in the field, she would be stuck in a hospital bed, unable to contribute to their unit's objectives. The nurse seemed to read her thoughts. "I know it's frustrating, but you need to focus on healing. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery if you follow the rehabilitation protocol." As the nurse left to tend to other patients, Sarah stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to process everything that had happened. The ambush, the firefight, the desperate race to the helicopter. It all seemed like a nightmare now that she was safe in the hospital, but something was nagging at the back of her mind, a detail that didn't quite fit. Why had the insurgents known exactly where to find them? How had they coordinated such a sophisticated ambush? And why did it feel like they had been specifically targeted rather than simply encountering a random enemy patrol? 3 days into her recovery, Sarah was sitting up in bed reading a letter from her parents when Rodriguez and Johnson appeared in her doorway. They looked tired and dusty from recent missions, but their faces lit up when they saw her awake and alert. "How's our hero doing?" Johnson asked with a grin, pulling up a chair beside her bed. He had brought a care package from their unit, candy, magazines, and a few personal items from her locker. "Better than I look, probably," Sarah replied, though she was genuinely happy to see them. The hospital had good care, but she missed the camaraderie of her unit. "What's the situation back at base?" Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. "That's actually what we came to talk about. There have been some developments since the ambush." He glanced around the room to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then moved his chair closer. "Intel has been investigating how the insurgents knew about our patrol route," he continued in a low voice. "Turns out there's been a pattern of compromised missions over the past month. Someone's been feeding information to enemy forces." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm hospital room. The idea that someone in their own ranks might be working with the enemy was almost too terrible to contemplate. "Do they have any suspects?" Johnson nodded grimly. "A few. But here's the thing. Whoever it is has been very selective about which operations to compromise. They seem to be targeting specific personnel rather than just causing maximum damage." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she had a growing suspicion about where this conversation was heading. Rodriguez pulled out a folder and showed her a list of names. "These are the soldiers who've been involved in compromised missions over the past 6 weeks. Notice anything?" Sarah scanned the list and immediately saw the connection. Every name belonged to someone who had distinguished themselves in combat, received commendations, or shown leadership potential. It wasn't random targeting. Someone was trying to eliminate the unit's most effective soldiers. "They're trying to weaken our capabilities," she realized. "Take out the best fighters and leave the unit less effective overall." "Exactly," Johnson confirmed. "And here's the scary part. You were specifically mentioned in intercepted communications. Someone put a bounty on you personally." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The ambush hadn't been a random encounter or even a typical insurgent operation. It had been a deliberate attempt on her life, orchestrated by someone who knew her identity, her skills, and her patrol schedule. "The investigation is ongoing," Rodriguez said, "but they wanted us to warn you. Even here in the hospital, you need to be careful. If there's a mole in our unit, they might try to finish what the ambush started." That evening, Sarah found herself looking at every hospital staff member with suspicion: the friendly nurse who brought her medications, the orderly who cleaned her room, even the doctor who checked her progress. Any of them could potentially be working with enemy forces. She was lost in these dark thoughts when a new patient was wheeled into the bed next to hers. The man appeared to be an Afghan civilian, probably in his 40s with severe burns on his arms and face. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize him, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Sarah couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation. The man had been injured in an explosion at a marketplace, caught in the crossfire between coalition forces and insurgents. He had been trying to protect his young daughter when the blast occurred. As the medical team finished their initial treatment and moved on to other patients, Sarah found herself staring at the injured man. Despite everything she had been through, despite the fear and suspicion now surrounding her, she felt a deep sadness for this civilian caught in the middle of a war he probably didn't fully understand. The man's eyes opened and met hers across the small space between their beds. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in heavily accented English, he whispered, "American soldier?" Sarah nodded carefully, unsure whether this was a friendly question or something more dangerous. But the man's expression was one of gratitude rather than hostility. "Thank you," he said simply. "You fight to protect my people too." Those words hit Sarah harder than she expected. In all the chaos and violence of her deployment, it was easy to lose sight of why they were there. But this man's simple gratitude reminded her that their mission was about more than just eliminating enemy fighters. It was about protecting innocent people who couldn't protect themselves. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself talking with her neighbor whenever the pain medications allowed him to stay awake. His name was Mahmoud, and he had worked as a translator for coalition forces before the explosion. He shared stories about his family, his hopes for his country's future, and his fears about the growing violence. Through these conversations, Sarah began to see the conflict from a different perspective. Mahmoud explained how the insurgents used intimidation and violence to control local populations, how they recruited young men by exploiting poverty and desperation, and how ordinary citizens like himself were caught between competing forces. "Many of my people want peace," Mahmoud told her during one of their talks. "But the fighters, they make it impossible. They use fear to control everything." Sarah was reminded of the empty village where they had been ambushed. The residents had been warned to leave, suggesting they had contacts who cared enough to keep them safe. But it also meant the insurgents had enough influence to coordinate such evacuations without detection. On her 5th day in the hospital, Sarah was finally allowed to walk around the ward for short periods. The physical therapy was painful, but she was determined to regain full use of her shoulder as quickly as possible. She wanted to get back to her unit and help investigate the security breach that had nearly cost them their lives. During one of these walks, she noticed a man in civilian clothes talking quietly with one of the hospital administrators. Something about his demeanor caught her attention. He stood like a soldier despite wearing local dress, and his eyes constantly scanned the area as if assessing threats. Sarah casually moved closer, pretending to read a bulletin board while straining to overhear their conversation. The man was speaking in a mixture of English and what sounded like Pashto, but she caught enough to understand he was asking about patient information. Specifically, he was asking about her. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She walked calmly back to her room, but her mind was racing. Was this the mole Rodriguez had warned her about? Or was it someone sent by enemy forces to finish what the ambush had started? She reached her bedside table and carefully palmed the small knife Johnson had smuggled to her hidden inside a book. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing if the suspicious visitor decided to pay her a more direct visit. Mahmoud noticed her tension. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated, then decided to trust him. In a low voice, she explained what she had observed. Mahmoud listened carefully, then nodded grimly. "I know this man," he whispered. "He is not. Friend to Americans, you are in danger." Sarah's blood ran cold as Mahmoud's words sank in. The man she had seen asking about her wasn't just suspicious. He was a confirmed threat. She gripped the small knife tighter, her mind racing through possible escape routes and defensive positions within the hospital room. "How do you know him?" she whispered back, keeping her voice barely audible. Mahmoud's face was grim. "His name is Rashid. He worked with Americans before, but then he began selling information to Taliban fighters. Many good people died because of what he told them. His eyes showed a mixture of fear and anger. He disappeared from my village 3 months ago. I thought he was dead. Sarah realized they were dealing with more than just a security breach. They were facing an active enemy agent who had infiltrated the base somehow. She needed to warn security immediately, but she also couldn't leave Mahmoud vulnerable if Rashid decided to eliminate any witnesses. "Can you get word to the American military police?" she asked. Mahmoud shook his head. "I am civilian patient. They will not believe me quickly enough. But you are soldier. They will listen to you." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that calling attention to herself might trigger Rashid to act before security could respond. She needed a way to alert authorities without revealing that she was aware of the threat. She pressed the call button for the nurse, trying to appear calm despite her racing heart. When the young corpsman arrived, she spoke in a normal tone while writing a message on a piece of paper. "I'm having some pain in my shoulder," she said aloud while sliding the note to Mahmoud. "Could you get me something for it?" The note read, "Emergency. Enemy agent in hospital asking about me. Contact military police immediately. Name, Rashid." Mahmoud read the message quickly, then nodded almost imperceptibly. As the corpsman left, to get pain medication, Mahmoud began speaking loudly in Pashto, calling out as if he was having a nightmare. The disturbance brought 2 nurses rushing over, and in the confusion he managed to whisper urgently to one of them in broken English. "American soldier in danger. Bad man here. Get help." The nurse looked confused but noticed Mahmoud's genuine distress. She glanced at Sarah, who nodded gravely. "Please," Sarah said quietly. "This man saved American lives before he was injured. If he says there's danger, you need to listen." Within minutes, Sarah could see the nurse speaking urgently with a supervisor near the nurse's station. The supervisor made a phone call, and shortly after, 2 military police officers entered the ward. But Rashid had apparently noticed the increased activity. Through the window of her room, Sarah could see him walking quickly toward the exit, his casual demeanor replaced by obvious urgency. He was going to escape before security could question him. Without thinking, Sarah stood up and walked toward the hallway. Despite the pain in her shoulder, she couldn't let this man disappear again, not when he had been responsible for so many deaths, including potentially her own teammates. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the lobby area. "Rashid, is that you?" The man froze, then turned slowly. His eyes met Sarah's, and she saw recognition and calculation in his expression. He knew that she knew who he was, and both of them understood that this moment would determine whether he escaped or was captured. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the busy hospital lobby. Then Rashid's hand moved toward his jacket, and Sarah realized he was armed. "Gun!" she shouted, diving behind a reception desk as Rashid pulled a pistol from his clothing. The lobby erupted in screams and chaos as patients, visitors, and staff scattered for cover. The military police officers reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and moving to flank Rashid's position. But the crowded hospital environment made their job extremely difficult. Too many innocent people in the line of fire. Rashid backed toward a stairwell, using panicked civilians as human shields while searching for an escape route. Sarah could see he was trained and experienced, moving with the confidence of someone who had been in similar situations before. One of the MPs tried to circle around, but Rashid spotted the movement and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Chunks of plaster rained down as people pressed themselves against walls and behind furniture. Sarah realized that her shoulder injury was actually an advantage in this situation. Rashid would assume she was helpless, unable to move quickly or fight effectively. But her father had taught her that the best hunters were those who could make their prey underestimate them. She began moving carefully along the wall, staying low and using the chaos to mask her approach. Her shoulder throbbed with every movement, but adrenaline was suppressing most of the pain. Rashid reached the stairwell and began backing up the steps, still keeping his weapon trained on the lobby. The military police were forced to maintain their distance, unable to risk shots with so many civilians in the area. That's when Sarah made her move. She had circled around to a position where she could access the stairwell from a different angle, one that Rashid hadn't been watching because he assumed she was still behind the reception desk. Moving as quickly and quietly as her injured condition allowed, Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor, then positioned herself at the top of the stairwell Rashid was ascending. She had one chance to stop him before he reached the upper level and potentially found more hostages or escape routes. As his head appeared around the turn in the staircase, Sarah struck with the small knife, aiming not to kill, but to disable his weapon hand. The blade caught him across the knuckles, causing him to drop the pistol with a curse of pain and surprise. Rashid spun toward her, but Sarah was already moving, using her good arm to grab his wrist while driving her knee toward his midsection. Her shoulder screamed in protest, but she held on as he tried to throw her down the stairs. They struggled for several seconds that felt like hours. Sarah's training and desperation matched against Rashid's size and experience. Finally, the military police reached the stairwell and were able to subdue him with tasers and restraints. As Rashid was taken into custody, Sarah collapsed against the stair railing, her shoulder injury reopened and bleeding through her hospital gown. But she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that this threat to her unit and other soldiers had been neutralized. The lead MP, a sergeant with concerned eyes, knelt beside her to check her condition. "Are you okay, Specialist?" That was incredibly brave, but also incredibly stupid. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Sometimes stupid and brave are the same thing, Sergeant. Did we get him?" "We got him, and thanks to you and your civilian friend's warning, we'll be able to interrogate him about other security breaches." The sergeant helped her stand carefully. "Let's get you back to the medical team before you bleed out on my watch." As they walked back toward the medical ward, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. The immediate threat was over, but she knew this was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Rashid's capture would hopefully lead to more information about the security breaches that had been plaguing their operations. Back in her room, Mahmoud greeted her with obvious relief. "You are safe," he said simply. But his eyes showed deep admiration for what she had accomplished despite her injuries. The medical team quickly went to work treating her reopened wounds while expressing varying degrees of amazement and disapproval at her actions. The doctor who had performed her original surgery shook his head as he cleaned the fresh injuries. "Specialist Martinez, you realize you've probably set back your recovery by at least 2 weeks?" he said while applying new bandages. "That shoulder needs rest, not combat operations." "Sometimes circumstances don't give you a choice, Doc," Sarah replied, wincing as he tightened the dressing. "How much longer before I can return to duty?" The doctor exchanged glances with the nurse. "Well, given your apparent inability to stay out of trouble even in a hospital bed, I'd say we need to get you healthy enough to defend yourself properly. 3 weeks minimum, assuming no more heroics." That evening, Rodriguez and Johnson returned to visit. Having heard about the incident through military channels, they brought news that Rashid's interrogation was already yielding valuable intelligence about enemy networks and compromised operations. Turns out, he had been working with a cell that specifically targeted high-performing soldiers, Rodriguez explained. "They were trying to demoralize our units by eliminating the people who set the example for others." Johnson added, "Command is reviewing all recent operations where casualties occurred. They think Rashid may have been responsible for compromising at least 6 missions over the past 2 months. Sarah felt a deep sadness thinking about the soldiers who might still be alive if Rashid had been caught sooner. But she also felt pride knowing that his capture would prevent future attacks and save other lives. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, his tone becoming more serious. "Command has been reviewing your actions during the ambush and today's incident. They're talking about putting you up for a commendation." Sarah shook her head. "I was just doing my job. Any soldier would have done the same thing." "Maybe," Johnson replied, "but not every soldier would have done it as well as you did." "The intelligence? Officers say Rashid was one of their most wanted targets. Taking him down was a major victory." As her friends left for the evening, Sarah reflected on the strange turn her deployment had taken. She had come to Afghanistan expecting to fight enemy forces in traditional combat situations. Instead, she found herself dealing with spies, traitors, and threats that came from within their own security perimeter. Mahmoud, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, spoke up after Rodriguez and Johnson departed. "You have good friends," he observed, "and you have proven yourself to be someone worth following." "I don't know about that," Sarah replied. "I just try to protect the people around me." "That is exactly what makes a good leader," Mahmoud said with a knowing smile. "In my culture we have a saying, the shepherd who fights the wolves is more valuable than the one who merely counts the sheep." Sarah pondered his words as she drifted off to sleep that night. She'd never thought of herself as a leader, just as a soldier trying to do her job well. But perhaps leadership wasn't about rank or position. Maybe it was about being willing to stand up when others needed protection, regardless of the personal cost. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A colonel she didn't recognize arrived with a small entourage, including what appeared to be intelligence officers and a military chaplain. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, wondering if she was in trouble for her unauthorized actions the previous day. "Relax, Specialist Martinez," the colonel said with a slight smile. "You're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, actually." The colonel pulled up a chair beside Sarah's bed while his entourage remained respectfully standing. Sarah noticed the insignia indicating he was from Special Operations Command, not her regular chain of command. This was clearly something bigger than a routine visit. "Specialist Martinez, I'm Colonel Harrison from SOCOM Intelligence," he began. "I understand you've had quite an eventful recovery period." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded. The colonel's expression was serious but not unfriendly, suggesting this wasn't a disciplinary meeting. "Rashid's capture has been a significant breakthrough for our operations throughout this region," Colonel Harrison continued. "His interrogation has already led to the disruption of 3 planned attacks and the identification of several other enemy agents." One of the intelligence officers stepped forward with a tablet computer. "We'd like you to look at some photographs and see if you recognize any other individuals who might have had access to your unit's operational information." Sarah spent the next hour reviewing dozens of images: local contractors, interpreters, supply personnel, and various civilians who had contact with coalition forces. Most faces were unfamiliar, but she flagged several individuals who had been present during mission briefings or had access to areas where operational details might have been overheard. "This is excellent work," the intelligence officer noted, as he reviewed her identifications. "Several of these individuals are already under investigation, and your confirmations help establish timelines for when security might have been compromised." Colonel Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Specialist, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering. How would you feel about helping us with a larger operation to identify and eliminate enemy intelligence networks?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of operation, sir?" "The kind that would require you to use the skills you've demonstrated, thinking quickly under pressure, identifying threats and taking action when necessary. It would also mean extending your deployment and working with specialized units rather than returning to your regular infantry assignment." The room fell silent as Sarah considered the implications. This was clearly an opportunity that could change the entire trajectory of her military career, but it would also mean leaving behind the unit and the friendships she had built over the past months. "May I ask what my teammates think about this?" she said finally. Colonel Harrison smiled. "Actually, Corporal Rodriguez and Private Johnson are part of the reason we're having this conversation. They've both spoken very highly of your tactical abilities and your leadership potential. In fact, they've both volunteered to join the operation if you decide to accept." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her friends. Even faced with a dangerous new assignment, they were willing to follow her into unknown territory. Mahmoud, who had been quietly listening from his bed, cleared his throat softly. "Colonel, if I may speak?" Harrison nodded, clearly curious about what the Afghan civilian wanted to contribute. "This soldier," Mahmoud said, gesturing toward Sarah. "She has something many fighters do not have. She sees people, not just enemies. When she fought to capture Rashid, she protected everyone around her, even me. That is rare in war." The colonel studied Mahmoud thoughtfully. "You know, we could use someone like you too, an interpreter who understands both cultures and has proven his loyalty under fire." Mahmoud's eyes widened in surprise. You would trust me with such work? Trust has to be earned, Harrison replied. But stopping an enemy agent from escaping definitely earns you consideration. Sarah looked between the colonel and Mahmoud. Then, at the intelligence officers who were waiting patiently for her decision. This was clearly bigger than just her own career. They were offering her a chance to build a team of people she trusted and work on operations that could genuinely make a difference in the outcome of the conflict. What would be our first mission? She asked. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with his intelligence officers before answering. There's a network of safe houses being used to coordinate attacks on coalition forces. Traditional approaches haven't been successful because the enemy always seems to know we're coming. We need a small team that can operate independently and adapt quickly to changing situations. Sarah thought about all the soldiers who had been killed or wounded because of compromised operations, all the families who had lost loved ones due to leaked intelligence. The opportunity to strike back at the networks responsible was compelling. I'll need to talk to Rodriguez and Johnson personally, she said. This has to be their choice, not just mine. Of course, Harrison agreed. Take all the time you need. This kind of work isn't for everyone, and we only want people who are absolutely committed. That afternoon, Rodriguez and Johnson returned for another visit. Though Sarah suspected they knew about the colonel's offer. Their behavior was subtly different, more respectful, as if they were already seeing her in a leadership role rather than just as a fellow soldier. So, Rodriguez said after they had exchanged pleasantries, heard you might be getting a promotion of sorts. Sarah smiled. Heard you two might be crazy enough to follow me into whatever comes next. Johnson grinned. Hey, following you has worked out pretty well so far. We're all still breathing and we took down a major enemy asset. This would be different, Sarah warned them. Special operations, longer deployments, higher risks. You could both request transfers to safer assignments instead. Rodriguez shook his head. We've been talking about it and we think you've got something most officers don't have. You actually care about the people under your command and you're willing to put yourself at risk to protect them. Plus, Johnson added, somebody needs to keep you out of trouble. Can't have you fighting enemy agents single-handed every time. We turn around. Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. These men were willing to trust her with their lives to follow her into dangerous situations because they believed in her abilities and her character. All right, she said, making her decision. Let's do this. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in front of a mirror in her new quarters at a classified facility, adjusting the sergeant's stripes that had been sewn onto her uniform. Her promotion had come through along with her acceptance into the Special Operations Unit. Her shoulder was nearly healed, and physical therapy had restored most of her range of motion. More importantly, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Rodriguez and Johnson had received their own promotions and specialized training assignments. Mahmoud was working with the intelligence team as a cultural advisor and interpreter, his knowledge of local networks proving invaluable. Colonel Harrison appeared in her doorway, carrying a sealed folder. Ready for your first briefing, Sergeant. Martinez? Sarah straightened and nodded. Yes, sir. Outstanding. Your team is assembled and waiting in conference room B. Time to see what you're really capable of. As they walked down the corridor toward her first mission briefing, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a small town in Texas to the battlefields of Afghanistan, from a routine patrol to hunting enemy intelligence networks. Her path had been anything but predictable, but she was ready. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the ambush, through the hospital confrontation, and through all the challenges that had tested her resolve. The war was far from over, but Sarah Martinez had found her place in it. She was no longer just another soldier following orders. She was a leader, a hunter of those who threatened her fellow warriors, and a protector of the innocent caught in the crossfire of conflict. The extraction helicopter had indeed touched down with her name on the list, but not in the way she had originally expected. It had carried her not just to safety, but to a new mission and a new destiny that would define the rest of her military career.